My name is Andrea Pennington. I'm an integrative physician, acupuncturist, best-selling author, and international speaker. I help doctors, therapists, coaches, speakers, and authors share their message with the world in the areas of resilience, trauma healing, and self-love. It's all part of my mission to elevate the level of consciousness in our world. After living for years, hiding depression and anxiety, I know how isolating and sickening it feels to be trapped, not living life aligned with your authentic self. As I've shared in my books and TED Talks, music saved my life and set me free from depression. And through a near-death experience, I reconnected with my soul and got a whole new vision to live for. Now, I combine my media communication experience with my professional expertise in meditation, neurofeedback, and holistic healing on stages, TV shows, and podcasts, in boardrooms and retreat centers around the world. My books, life writing programs, and brand mentoring academy are all designed to empower you to transform, heal, and thrive in business and in life. Welcome, welcome, beautiful soul. I am so grateful to have you with me today. These have been interesting times that we've experienced together, right, in 2020. But today, we're going to have another dose of reality, but also a dose of hope. Because I'm sure as you have tuned in to my emissions before, I definitely got to focus on the hope to get us through what we've been experiencing this year. So you may not have seen this, but I recently posted on Instagram and on Facebook some of my experiences with racism and with colorism. I have never wanted to share what I've gone through publicly, simply because I was brought up to not play the race card. I happen to be the daughter of a very proud immigrant mother from British Guyana. And my mom did experience incredible racism, which, she didn't hide that from me and my siblings. She moved to the United States from England, a brown woman, as she says, a brown woman with a funny accent. And she put herself into medical school with 3 small children. So I was only 3 years old when she graduated. And I always heard about how she was treated by the white physicians, and in particular the white male physicians. But my mother took on the challenge of racism with grace. That's part of her legacy. And she didn't ever play the victim. She always took the stride of, okay, if I'm going to be smacked for the color of my skin, I'm going to just step up and be bolder and be more fierce. And so that's kind of what I took on. I didn't play the race card for pity or for anything. And I also, unfortunately, never complained about what I experienced. And as a physician, when I bonded with my patients, we would talk about what challenges we experienced as Black and brown people. And of course, as a physician, I would go the extra mile to support and educate my Black and brown patients, because I know that for many of us, the deck is just stacked against us for a whole host of reasons. So we're going to get into that because we need to be real and honest about what Black and brown people are facing, especially as it pertains to their health, but also what we physicians are experiencing and what we can do to be a part of the solution. So I know this might seem like a little bit of a heavy topic. I'm grateful that some of you have already chimed in, that you're looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Golda. Thank you, Dr. Isla. Welcome, Cavell. It's good to have you here with us as well. So today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Sara Gottfried. She is a board-certified OBGYN. She specializes in women's health and empowerment. She's a multiple New York Times bestselling author. But today, Dr. Sara will be joining us as a biracial physician who is also on a mission to help address the disparities in healthcare and in the practice of medicine. So I'm so grateful to have you here for this conversation. Dr. Sara, welcome to Conscious Evolution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrea. I'm just so happy to be here, happy to be with our people. Really looking forward to this conversation.
It's a conversation that is probably long overdue, I will admit. The last time I think I really talked about the differences with race and healthcare was when I was on the Oprah show. And this was many, many years ago. And Oprah kind of made a joke because I was telling her that for African Americans, sometimes we're very tempted to eat all the rice and the bread and the sugar. And she listened to my list and she was like, "You're telling us that we need to avoid all the white stuff." And I was like, "Oh gosh, don't go there." I'm not trying to say that. But what I do know is that we need to have these conversations. And it's people like you, people who have a platform and a voice and that respect that comes along with it, that we need to really have these real in-depth conversations. So what I'd like to do, if we can, Sara, is if we can start with today and then we can move back, because you've actually been addressing healthcare disparities, particularly among women, but of course you know what that's like for people of color. But let's start with something that people are just hearing about now in 2020. If they've never heard about the others, they're starting to realize that with COVID, Black and brown people are suffering and dying at higher rates than whites. So talk to me about your vision on what's going on.
Well, let me say first that I think this is a very complex topic. And, you know, I want to honor the fact that there's so many experts in this field. And I would say that, like you described, I've only been talking about race more recently. And I would even say that the way that I've considered my care of patients is that I take respectful care of my patients regardless of their skin color. And what I realized over the past year and a half is that's not enough. That's not enough. It's a step in the right direction, but it's nowhere near what's needed for the crisis, the racial pandemic that we're facing. So you asked about SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and the data are very troubling. So the worst disparity that I've seen documented, I'm going to put my geek hat on first, is a study that was published by Yale in April, showing that Black folks were dying at 3.57x the white folks, 3.57x. So that is a horrible statistic. What I've seen, as I've followed there's a racial tracker that's looking at COVID statistics, and this is a really interesting piece of work that's been put forth by Ibram X. Kendi and his anti-racist center, his Center for Anti-Racism Research, together with The Atlantic, some journalists from The Atlantic. And what I just looked 2 days ago, and what I saw was that with what he's tracking in the US, Blacks are dying at about 1.5x the rate of whites. So not quite as high as that statistics from April, but still alarming. So I think those are, the truth is probably somewhere in that range, a 50% higher risk of mortality among Black people.
So let's talk about the why. And actually, this will certainly apply to the other health disparities we see in Black people, like with cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, obesity, diabetes, and on and on. But let's talk specifically, like, why is it? Why is it that Black people are dying at higher rates from COVID-19?
Well, I'd love to riff with you on this because this is, the why I think is quite complex. And so we could start first with some of the underlying health conditions, most of which I think of as driven by social determinants.
Yeah.
So we can get into the details of that. But I also want to say, in kind of a meta message around this, I started to post more about racial disparity. I was struck by a couple of things. I was really struck by the number of people who would respond to my post about COVID-19 or my post about, twice the rate of Alzheimer's in Blacks versus whites, or, 4x the increased risk of maternal mortality. Folks would say, oh, well, it's what they eat. And so this is one of those places where we need to get really clear. Yeah. And I hope you'll help me with this. This is socially determined. Race is socially constructed. It is not a difference in biology. It is not a difference in genetics. You and I are 99.9% the same genetic code. We maybe have a slight difference in our melanin. Otherwise, there's not a difference in our biology. So I think when we get to the why, there's so many reasons for it. So certainly the risk factors are different, like hypertension. We know dementia is a major risk factor, and that's twice as high in Blacks versus whites. But there's these social determinants that I hope we can talk about.
Yeah, I'd love to. And in fact, for those of you who have never heard of this, the social determinants of health, at least for America, we typically think of these 5 factors. The social determinants include things like economic stability, education, of course, health and health care, the neighborhood, the built environment around you, and the community context or the social context. So when we're talking about the social determinants of health and how Black and brown people are at a disadvantage, as you point out, Dr. Sara, it's not about our genes. It's not something within our biology necessarily. But if we look at, well, let's talk about 2 different things. I definitely want to talk about the stress and the weathering that we see with racism, because that is the social context of what impacts our health. But we can also just talk about the basic things. Like I know what you're talking about when people say, oh, it's because the reason that Black people are, heavier or they have more diabetes, it's because of what they eat. And it's not just a behavioral choice of what they put in their mouth. It is determined by what they're brought up to hear as healthy and not healthy. And of course, what's available. Like we talk about food deserts. Like there's a paucity. There's not enough healthy food choices in many of the neighborhoods where young Black people are being raised. And so they eat what they're taught to eat, but also what's actually available.
That's right. I think this issue of availability is so important. And it's, if we take a step even higher to policy, kind of public policy, and the politics that we have in the US, that's where we see racism just as a through line for all of these conversations. And, I live in Oakland, California. I'm right on the border between Oakland and Berkeley. It's a very diverse city. And as you described, there are parts of Oakland that have a farmer's market 3 days a week and have access to, every grocery store you could imagine. And then there's parts of Oakland that are food deserts where it's very hard, even if you're extremely motivated and you have the money, to get the vegetables that you need. So I think, that piece I think social determinants are such an important part of this conversation. And I do hope we can talk about stress because, what I was struck by when I was looking at some of the original data on racial weathering, on the wear and tear that happens as a result of the color of your skin. I was so struck by the original data that was collected by a professor at the University of Michigan back in, I think it was 1992. It was a long time ago. What she found when she looked at a number of different populations. She looked at Birmingham, Alabama, Minneapolis, Oakland, California, and Chicago. And one of the things she found is that racial weathering is far worse for Black women than it is for Black men. Now, we could probably debate that because I feel like Black men have their own challenges. We've certainly seen that with George Floyd. I was watching last night about a man from Georgia who was wrongly had excessive force used against him by the police. But I was so struck by the fact that Black women are aging faster, biologically aging faster, certainly than white women, but even more than Black men as a result of racism. So, there's a few reasons for that, and it's not just poverty. A lot of people think this is purely socioeconomic, but what this woman found, I want to make sure I get her name right. Do you know her name? Geronimus, I think is her last name?
Yes, exactly. It is Geronimus, and back in 2006, they were actually studying telomere length. So looking at, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, so I hope we'll talk about telomere length because I think that data is super interesting too. But one of the things she found was that the fastest aging group of people was poor Black women. And the second fastest was non-poor Black women. So I think it's important to realize this is not just socioeconomic. It's much broader than that.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. So you just mentioned that weathering is this accelerated aging, and they measure it, looking at your biological age versus your chronological age. And seeing that Black women are aging faster, meaning you can actually test biomarkers inside of us to see. It's not just, some random assessment of age. So when we think about race and racism and what a Black woman might experience in America, that translates to stress. So, for example, the discrimination that many Black women have experienced in the workplace and not feeling safe enough to speak up. So for example, with the trauma work that I've spent a lot of time doing, we know that for people who keep secrets, for people who don't feel like they have an ally, some compassionate ally or coach or supporter that they can share with, the more we keep secrets, that is a source of stress. Now, it's not just the being bullied and teased and the outward stuff. It's also what we inflict upon ourselves unknowingly. I mean, nobody, knowingly does this. But there's this intensity that I think we're starting to see unbottled, if I'm honest. Like, I wouldn't have shared my racism experience if it weren't for what's going on right now in 2020. Of course, I share it privately, but I would have never shared it on public, on social media. So when you think about what Black women are experiencing without any outlet, without any safe place to be seen and heard and have it processed, let alone, rectifying the situations, for example, in the workplace, then it's quite obvious to see how that stress can impact us. Now, you've worked in prenatal care and taking care of moms and babies. What do you know about stress and the body and brain, just so that we can start to help people make a connection between how racism can impact us on a physiologic basis?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that about secrets, because I think it's a great place to start with this conversation. Thank you, Andrea. So there's so many places I want to go with this, so I'm gonna try to contain myself. I think one of the things you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that there's a cost to this stress. And the way I describe this to patients is that there's two different types of stress. There's the hormetic stress, the kind of stress that's good for you, the stress that gets you motivated to study for an exam. And then there's toxic stress, the kind of stress that, racism is toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences are toxic stress. And so with that secret that you were talking about, the first thing that I go to is adverse childhood experiences, because we now have 20 years of data showing that when you experience 4 or more, even 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, and we can get into the details of what those are, they make disease happen in middle age in a way that many physicians are not aware of. And so I think we need to highlight this because women experience more ACEs than men. Mm-hmm. And certainly our BIPOC brothers and sisters experience more ACEs than their white counterparts. So, I'm reading this amazing book by Nadine Burke-Harris called The Deepest Well.
It's an excellent one.
She's our Surgeon General here in California, as you know. And I got to meet her in February, and I just was so struck by I was at an Alzheimer's task force, and she was talking about the connection between adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress and Alzheimer's disease. And if you've read her book, she starts off with this incredible story of a man she calls Evan, who wakes up and can't move. He's 43 years young. He wakes up in his bed next to his wife, who's sleeping soundly, and he can't move. He needs to pee, and so he's trying to get up out of bed, and he can't. Can't move his right arm, can't move his right leg. And his wife later overhears the doctor talking about his case in the emergency room. And you can kind of picture this, us as physicians can sort of hear this, 43-year-old man, stroke, no risk factors. And yet he has this incredible risk factor of adverse childhood experiences. So I imagine you have some things to say about ACEs.
Absolutely. Definitely from my work dealing with trauma. So I don't know that you know this, but before I went full on holistic traveling the world, I ran an intensive outpatient treatment program in the Washington, D.C. area. And we treated a lot of people with obesity, addiction, eating disorders. And it was very interesting to me that creating a holistic environment with everything that you needed. We had psych, we had fitness, we had a holistic spa, acupuncture, cognitive behavioral therapy, everything. And it was also in a very beautiful setting, if I do say. And the majority of our patients, when coming in and learning how the body and brain worked and getting proper labs and nutrition and all of that, they would just skyrocket. They would just do so much better. But I discovered that there was this subset of our patients that would either sabotage themselves or they would come up with some other addiction or some other thing. And as we started to really investigate why were these other people so successful and the others weren't, we discovered that there were significant ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences. And that's when I really had to dive in and do more training in trauma. So for those of you that are tuning in, and I want to acknowledge you, thank you, Karan, who actually, she says, the Pennington Institute was a movement in and of itself. She actually got to see me there. That's how we met. And Shelley Thomas says that her telomeres were nearly gone when she got tested. And so, and Shelley knows she's been a caretaker for someone with special needs, as happens with us as parents. But for those of you who are tuning in who have never heard of ACEs, just to give you kind of a rundown, these adverse childhood experiences that we're talking about can be several. And if you go to my website or the Innate Vitality website, you can take a little quiz to find out your ACE score. So as Dr. Sara was saying, if you have 4 or more, even just 2 or more of these, there's an increased likelihood that you will develop some of these chronic diseases. And so the adverse childhood experiences that we're talking about, they fall into multiple categories. One is maltreatment, meaning that you were abused. That can be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. That can also include neglect or abandonment. There's also household adversity, which I believe, Dr. Sara, and I think we should talk about this as well. I think we're going to see people, just experiencing COVID and what their parents are going through from losing jobs, having that financial insecurity. So household adversity, typically we're thinking about things like domestic abuse, which also doesn't mean that you experienced it, but witnessing it. Substance abuse. If you have a family member, a close family member who was mentally ill or being treated for mental illness, if somebody close to the family or in the family committed suicide, for example. There's also criminality, and also for people who've grown up in foster care. So if you've had any of those experiences, and particularly the younger, before the age of 18, we know that that has an impact on our physiology, even down to our DNA. It impacts the nervous system such that even just with COVID, a lot of people saw their stress like go off the charts. And a lot of people ask me, like, why am I so anxious? Like, I've already got enough food and toilet paper. But when you go back and you look at their ACEs and you look at what may have happened in childhood, their nervous system has been tweaked. So when we look at what you're describing, like if you've had some sort of these adverse childhood experiences that have impacted the stress system on the body, nearly all of the diseases that I'm sure you see and saw or treated that had this connection, they're higher. Things like autoimmune conditions, allergies, asthma, arthritis, the list goes on. I'm only in the A's at this point. So yeah, I really feel like every physician needs to be trauma informed, if not even trauma trained.
Well, I totally agree with that. And I think, I want to circle back to prenatal care, because I think there's another important point here about ACEs, which is, two important points. The first is a lot of the research on ACEs and on trauma is done on white people. And so we need much better data sets when it comes to understanding some of the racial disparity, and also, waving a flag for hope here for really understanding the treatments that are effective. Yeah. Because it's probably, I would assume, until proven otherwise, that the treatments that are effective for a Black woman might be different than the treatments that are effective for a white veteran male. And so we need to understand some of those differences. A lot of the research that's been done on the next topic that I hope we'll get to, which is intergenerational transmission of wounds, of stress and weathering. When you look at the data, especially by Rachel Yehuda, who's at Mount Sinai, her work was done in the Holocaust. Yeah. And, my background is that I'm about 9% Black. And I've also got some Jewish, I've got some Irish, I've got some other different haplotypes if you look at my DNA. So I have some Jewish blood, and I really relate to her work on, what happened with our brothers and sisters that survived the Holocaust. What's different with those who have post-traumatic stress disorder versus those who don't, who are more resilient. At least the way we measure it. But a lot of that research was done on white people. So here's the Holocaust with that research. She also has looked at women who are pregnant in the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York. Again, there wasn't a huge number of pregnant women, but it was mostly white women. And so I think there's this racial bias that goes, into the research, as well as the policy, as well as the healthcare, as well as the medical care.
And I think I love that you're bringing that up, so that if we think about, let's just get into access, if we can, right? Sure. So the next step. So let's say that someone has experienced some form of trauma in this lifetime, or they are a descendant of anyone who's been colonized, but could be descendants of slaves. It could be the Holocaust survivors, genocide survivors. If we look at those people, many times they are forced to kind of just suck it up and keep moving. In other words, and especially in the Black community, for a while, it's not the same now, thank God, but for a while, there was a shame and stigma put on you if you went to see a therapist. Because the reality is, like you're pointing out with Yehuda's studies, not everyone who experiences trauma falls into PTSD. Like some people bounce forward with post-traumatic growth. And so part of the difference is having some compassionate caregiver or someone to process it with. But many times, whether it's stigma or access, a lot of Black people and Black women have not had access to trauma-trained therapists or doctors who could hear them out and help them work through or get the resources that would help them heal.
Absolutely. I mean, I think access is at the core of the problem here. And it's also, I want to say one quick thing about the legacy of slavery. And I want to say that, as someone who's mixed race but passes as white, I want you to call me out if I say anything that smacks of white privilege. So please hold me to that, even if it's like mid-sentence.
Will
please. Okay. So I agree with you that there's this core issue of access, and there's this legacy of enslaved women being used in experiments by the medical system without their consent, often without anesthesia. When I think of the work of Marion Sims, a gynecologist from the South, and the corrections he would do of vesico-vaginal fistulas, kind of these connections between the bladder and the vagina. There's one woman in particular that he did 30 surgeries on without anesthesia. So I think there's a mistrust,
Absolutely.
too, of a healthcare system that has failed many, many people. And so it's a lack of access to the people who could help with trauma. I think again of Nadine Burke-Harris and this amazing clinic that she had in Hunters Point. And she was so surprised that she was able to get the California Pacific Medical Center to fund this clinic. And, she says it like 3 times in the first chapters. And I just was so struck by that. Like, look at how we have failed people. Look at how we have made it so difficult for someone as stellar as Nadine Burke-Harris to provide this kind of care, this kind of integrative care from a pediatric standpoint, but also to heal from trauma.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of her work, and you're so right. And the other thing I think that was really beautiful about The Deepest Well was to give people who may not have ever had the experience a glimpse into what it could be like as a healthcare provider to deliver culturally sensitive healthcare without all the judgment and so on. So let's talk a bit about healthcare, because as a Black physician, I experienced the racism myself in the hospital systems and what have you. And that impacts us as physicians about what are we willing to advocate for, right? What do we feel safe enough to amidst all the other constraints? But also, there's like so much education that needs to go on to help other non-white physicians, non-Black physicians, to deliver that culturally sensitive healthcare.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, I think it starts with internal work. And as I remember I was on a webinar about 2 weeks ago with a group of about 100 clinicians, and the focus was really listening in a deep way to our Black colleagues. And I was struck by something that I haven't asked her permission to share this, so I won't use her name, but a very seasoned Black physician, a pathologist, said, white people need to talk to white people. So I took that in because I totally understand what she's saying. I mean, I think we need a diversity of voices, of course, but I really took that to heart, meaning that I need to speak up.
Yeah.
So I agree with all of the memes that we have about white silence, white fragility, white privilege, white supremacy. But I think in many ways, before white people start talking, we've really got to do that internal work. We need to go through me and white supremacy day by day and do the journaling prompts. But I'm also sensitive to a really great post that I saw in the Washington Post, an article that said, when Black people are in pain, white people join book clubs. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So we really need to step into action. Another thing, Andrea, that's related to healthcare, and I'm curious if you've been noticing what I've been noticing, or if you have any thoughts about this. I've been looking at the response of different healthcare systems to our racial pandemic. And I started with my alma maters. So I went to Harvard and UCSF and a few other places, and I was underwhelmed, honestly. In fact, one of them I would give a marginal pass to, the other one I would not pass at all. And I found some other medical centers like Jefferson Health in Philadelphia, who had this bold statement above the fold on their website with 5 things that they were committed to doing to make their care anti-racist. And it was signed by 3 stakeholders, white males, of course, but it's a step in the right direction. So do you have any thoughts or reflections about this in terms of healthcare and how we can make it anti-racist?
Well, I agree with you. I feel like that thank God for all of the trauma of this year, because people are no longer being silent and people are collectively holding others to account. So when we hold a healthcare system accountable for this disparity in COVID-19 deaths among Black people, and other disparities, I think that is a big piece of it. Now, what I'm curious to see is how much of this is just going to be, I'm putting up a nice statement to show that I was here and I agree, and how much of it is actually going to carry forward. I think the big medical centers, well, I don't know. I want to say I'm keeping hope alive that this is not just lip service. I think that ultimately people are going to hold them accountable and not speak and not be silent anymore. And I think that's part of it. So there are 2 things that I want to say in regards to that. So you mentioned that it's internal. And so Dion Johnson, who's in the UK, says, yes, it starts with the internal, which you said as well. What I think is happening, and now we're gonna step over into my world of conscious evolution. I feel like the majority of humans evolve or change when it gets painful enough. And I think the white people who are being called out on their racism, who are losing work and friends and followers, might actually be listening. But I also feel that there is a greater awakening happening on the planet, that people that were never spiritual, that never even cared about stuff, there's something happening to the consciousness. Such that for me here in Europe, I have a very good friend, I have lots of friends in Scandinavia, and a couple of them sent me pictures of them at Black Lives Matter rallies. And I'm like, y'all just doing this to look good, or what's behind it? And when you actually dig deep, there are non-Black people who are enraged at what is happening to Black people all over the world, but in particular to what's happening to Black Americans. So when I see this, when I see that white people are willing to speak up, to lose things that matter to them, money, followers, business, and so on, then I think there is a shift in consciousness. So yes, I do feel like white people need to talk to white people. White people need to listen to Black and brown and people of color, but they also need to listen to their conscience, which I think is what's happening. I think that people will speak up and dare to, because when you finally realize, or you wake up to the reality that we are all one human family, if I see my brother or sister being abused, I will not be silent. I must speak up. And we see doctors experiencing that with COVID, doctors who've lost their jobs because they spoke out against not having PPE, but also doctors who are, and nurses, all sorts of healthcare professionals that I've seen on social media posting that the Black people in the hospitals were not getting the same treatment as white people in the hospitals with COVID. So I think there is a shift in the consciousness that makes me hopeful, or at least that's what I'm holding on to.
Well, that's beautifully articulated. And I have that same hope. I also think that this point that you made about accountability is incredibly important. So yes, I hope there's this global shift in consciousness. And this reminds me a bit of the work of, I'm just learning about this, cultural humility. So I've done training in the past in cultural competence as part of taking care of patients. But again, I don't think that goes quite far enough. I just was watching a video over the weekend about cultural humility, which has three main tenets. The first tenet is a lifelong commitment to this kind of inquiry that you're talking about. Self-reflection and also self-critique, inventory. The second is recognizing these power imbalances that we have and working to change them, fix them. And then the third is institutional accountability, so that we can go to Jefferson Health in 3 months and 6 months and 9 months and 12 months and say, okay, those 5 things that you committed to, where are you? Where's your scorecard? Harvard and UCSF and say, like, what are you doing?
Exactly. Well, it's a good point, because one of our dear friends, Shelley Thomas in the US, who's an attorney, she wrote in, like, where is the accountability? So how could we hold a healthcare system to account? I mean, we could say, okay, show us your scorecard. Is that something we should do? Should we be advocating for sort of a checkup system, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the line, to see where we stand with the changes in policy?
Well, I'd love to brainstorm this with you, because I think the institutional accountability is essential if we want change. And we need anti-racist policy. I really love the work of Ibram X. Kendi and how he talks about, it's not that helpful to talk about racist people versus anti-racist people. It's much more helpful to talk about racist policy versus anti-racist policy. And I love this second part, which a lot of people forget from that sentence, which is we need to focus on racist policymakers versus anti-racist policymakers. And I feel like that piece in particular is what's really missing in medicine. So yes, I do think that we should have some sort of accountability system. I don't know that we have one. I was looking, for instance, at the World Health Organization and the work that they've done with social determinants of health. And they had, 2 main categories that they were trying to address. But I think in some ways, there's not enough teeth in their accountability. So I don't know how you get the teeth or the power to be able to hold these folks accountable, but I would sure love to do it.
Yeah.
So maybe you and I could work with Professor Kendi when he's at Boston University, and we can hold these folks accountable.
Yeah, I definitely think it's going to happen. And I think it is going to be some sort of a task force or a committee that's going to hold these folks to account and make them speak up. And the sense that I get with what's happening this year is that we're not going to back down. That for the activists who will step up and say, show me the book, show me the numbers, show me the stats, that there are going to be enough of us that will say, yeah, we're not going to shut up until you do. I think that's what I have to hold on to. And my friend Karan in the US says she had to learn to ask for a trauma-trained therapist. And the first time she did, she was questioned about why it was her request. And in fact, earlier this year, she found that she fired a therapist that was culturally incompetent and who was obviously racist, but to other people, she was, quote unquote, a good white woman. So thank you for sharing that, Karan. But I definitely feel like these are the kinds of conversations and accountability that we can have internally. And of course, you don't know Karan, but she's not one who's going to back down easily. But we need more people to feel like it's safe enough for us to speak up, for us to challenge our healthcare workers and our healthcare system so that we can see the change that we're all counting on.
Well, we have to see the change. I agree with you. I think We won't stand for status quo. We can't status quo. If it doesn't trouble your soul that 5 times as many Black women die in childbirth as white women, then I don't know what's going to motivate change, because that is the most tragic, horrific number I've ever heard in my life. Especially as someone who is part of the problem as an obstetrician gynecologist. So we've got to make these changes. And, time and again, what I see is this approach to the crisis of maternal mortality or the crisis of cardiovascular disease and racial disparity. What I see is a lot of white men working on the problem. And so we need those policy stakeholders to be at a minimum representative of our population. Another thing I've been doing on Instagram is listening very carefully to Black female physicians. And I'm blown away that only 2% of practicing physicians in the US are Black women. And that's just appalling to me. So I agree with you. It's going to change. It has to change.
Yeah. And we will be part of the change. Absolutely. So we have some people chiming in. We won't back down. Thank you, Dion. And Shelley, who was a lawyer, she says she's working on a task force in Georgia. So we've been mobilized. I think for those of us who are feeling our recessive activist gene being activated, I think mine has just been suppressed. I'm on. It's on. And I'm not backing down.
Yeah.
And
same.
Good. And I also know that in the midst of the turmoil and the trauma, we have got to do what we can to lower our stress response so that we can actually last long enough to see the results of this fight. Because the racism we've been living with is already causing weathering, but also what we're experiencing now in 2020 and just witnessing it all unfold is also stressful. So what are you advising people close to you to do? My favorite is, breath work and meditation and journaling. I mean, I could go on. But what are you really committed to sharing with other people so that they can manage the stress right now?
I'm glad you circled back to this, because I just was looking at some data on the stress of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in surveys that have been done of employees, 88% of them report moderate to severe stress. So I agree with you. I think we're creating ACEs, we're creating kind of this stress cohort that is unlike any we've seen before. Maybe similar to the Spanish flu, but that was a long time ago. So, the first thing I do is I go to the literature. Like, what do we know from science? And all the things that you mentioned, in terms of the physiological cost of toxic stress, we know that there are certain things that are proven to really make a difference, like breath work, like yoga is one of my favorites, because it really helps you, be able to re-inhabit your body in a safe way, which for someone who's a trauma survivor, my ACE score is 6, it's really helpful to have that conversation and to trust your body and trust your feelings again. Mm. What I found with folks who are traumatized is that sometimes meditation, like sitting on a cushion or even mindfulness, is not as helpful. Right. I've seen sort of mixed responses there. One thing that I saw in the research on racial weathering that I really took to heart is that the Black women who had more social connections and belonged to groups and had this support they were tending and befriending, they had a much better experience with racial weathering, meaning that their biological age was closer to their chronological age. So I think that's another really important piece, that much of the research, here's another racist truth bomb. The research that was done on the stress response by Walter Cannon at Harvard Medical School in the 1930s was done on white men. Yeah. And it was assumed to apply to women. It was assumed to apply to other races, and it doesn't necessarily. I think women in some ways do much better when they tend and befriend. So even talking, from Oakland, California to where you are in the south of France, like I feel this oxytocin just talking to you because you're a healer, you're a lovely human being. We're talking about such a crucial topic, and those sort of connections really make a difference with the biological cost of toxic stress.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to keep in mind that even with the social distancing, if we can have some eye-to-eye contact with Zoom or FaceTime or whatever your preferred mode of communication, that helps. And yeah, we've got to speak up. Gladys has written in self-care and restorative yoga for race-based trauma and stress. Absolutely. So self-care, I recently posted about this. A lot of people with COVID shifted into creative mode, launching businesses, saying they're going to write a book. And then there were others that are just like, what are you talking about? I'm just barely surviving. So recognizing your own rhythms and what you need right now, chill out. You don't have to be this, super uber productive person, but absolutely stay connected. One of my tendencies, I'm an introvert, I'm an ambivert, but I love being home alone. And I love just kind of being in my cave, and I go into creativity and meditation and chanting. And I noticed that I was really, when quarantine lifted here in France, I was still turning down invitations to go out with friends. And I'm like, I see a pattern here. And as soon as I did start to reach out again and just go for walks on the beach with friends, it made such a difference. And I didn't even know that I needed that difference. So it's just a reminder to all of us that we do need to speak up, to connect. And it doesn't always have to be negative stuff. Like lately I've been sharing, I don't know what you'll think of this, but I've been sharing TikToks. My daughter, 14-year-old daughter, I'm finally like looking at TikTok and I'm like, a lot of it's nonsense, but there's some really creative and funny people. And it's just like, it's instead of sharing all of the drama, like let's share a little bit of laughter. So
I love that. I have a 15-year-old daughter and a 20-year-old daughter, so we're very familiar with TikToks in this house. And I think social media can be a force of good, and TikToks are a great example of that. And it's also, it's a fun way to hang out with them and to speak their love language. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to honor you for something you said that I think is really important for our listeners and followers, and that is you made this point about sheltering in place lifting where you are in France and how you didn't necessarily shift the way that you were interacting with others right away. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity in that in many ways, because it may be that the way that I did my life before COVID-19 wasn't actually the most aligned or congruent way of living my life. And so I've been thinking a lot about that because, I was doing about 80% travel before this virus hit us, right? And there's a lot of weathering that happens with that level of travel. And so I've realized, I could do a lot more virtually. I mean, I knew that before the pandemic, but there's ways of us, I'm an educator, there's ways of us doing more education that takes advantage of technology so that we can get much more intentional, as you did, about how we want to connect with others. I mean, certainly getting in nature, I think, is important. We all need that. But being much more intentional about our work and our workflow.
Yeah. Well, that is definitely the word of the day, I think. Intention. I think we're all setting these intentions to heal, to be more mindful of what we allow into our lives as we're investigating. There is no returning to normal. Normal was not healthy in and of itself. So I'm so grateful that we've had this time together, Sara. It's it really is an honor, because I know that this is something that's very near and dear to your heart and that you're actively vocal on social media. So I'm really grateful that we were able to sit down and chat, and it looks like from the comments that have come in so far, the rest of the world is happy for it too. So I've put on screen that people can follow you. It's Sara Gottfried MD on Instagram and saragottfriedmd.com. Is there anything else that you're working on that you'd like the listening audience to know about?
Well, I want to follow up with you on accountability. Maybe we can do sort of a part two at some point. It's funny, Andrea. The other thing I'm working on is my next book. So I'm working on my 5th book, which is about fat loss in women. And here's what I have to say about that. It feels like so irrelevant and not where I need to be focused right now. And as someone who has recovered from an eating disorder, I'm really sensitive to the topic of weight. Our worth is so much more than the number on the scale. And I wanted to write, sort of a sacred, science-based approach to, how do you figure out a healthy weight for yourself, healthy muscle mass to really power you to do the activism that, is now being expressed in my body and yours. But the way that I'm approaching it has changed. So that's something that I'm kind of sitting with as I work through this. And this is a place where I feel like I've learned so much from my Black sisters, because I think in many ways, white women suffer a lot more with body image issues. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I want to hear your perspective, but I think in many ways, Black women are more advanced in terms of body love and acceptance, even with all of these social determinants that we're talking about. I know you're trying to wrap up, but I couldn't help but pose that as a question.
No, it's totally fine. Louise says, thank you for the guest. And Dion says, I'm so grateful to both of you. And she's cheering us on. And Laura Nguyen has also said she would love a part 2. So no need to rush. But here's what I would say about being a Black woman and body image. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. But here's what I'll say. First of all, yes, please continue this work on this book, because the world needs it. Women need it, including women of color. And the reason why I will single out women of color is because, it is true that for many of us, there's not the same level of body shaming that we see in non-Black or non-colored people, right? For example, when I got to Georgia, so I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and I never had any issue with my body. I don't know. I just didn't. I knew that I inherited my mama's behind, but I never had any stigma until I got to Georgia. Now, in Georgia, what I thought was a big behind was nothing. And in fact, I got body shamed for being too thin. And so here's the double-edged sword that I saw when I became a physician. So leaving there where the African, it's not everyone, please y'all do not send me no hate mail. I'm not saying everybody in Georgia, but I'm saying what I experienced as a university student in Georgia was the Black folks had this sense of pride, rightfully so, in their bodies, but it became to their detriment when they said, I don't need to lose weight because I'm thick like my mama, or my man loves me cuz. And the only challenge with that is there is still a higher risk with obesity that impacts your health, your heart, your kidneys, your everything. And so I think if you are really taking a more sensitive approach to writing your book about weight loss, fat loss, and building muscle, I think women of color will need that as well. It's not because we are dealing with eating disorders per se, but we absolutely need to have a healthier, not all of us, again, y'all, no hate mail, not all of us, but we do need Black women to recognize that, yes, love your curves, love the fact that we are curvy and, big boned, as they say, and honor that beautiful vessel of yours to keep it as healthy as it can be so that we can decrease all of these other social determinants and all of these other chronic diseases. I am now off my soapbox.
No, that's beautiful. I may need to quote you, Andrea, in this new book. I will take that to heart. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's an important piece, because what I noticed in my weight loss practice is that even when the ladies got down to a healthy BMI, their body mass index, they still had all the curves, and their loved ones still thought they were fly. So it's not like you need to lean on the body image thing just to, be Black power. Anyway, so that's enough. Again, I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Sara. And I'm grateful that we're connected and that we have other mutual connections in place. And I would absolutely love to have another conversation where we can sort of follow up on, where we are with what 2020 has brought to our awareness. And then, of course, when your book comes out, we can do an interview around the book.
I would love that. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the conversation.
Me too. So there you have it, my friends. This has been a wonderful conversation. I know that you will be tuning in and following Dr. Sara on Instagram, on Facebook, and on her website. I so appreciate it. So, hey, you know the drill. You know what I always say to you, my dear friend. You are a gift to this world. So please share your presence with passion. Much love, and I'll see you again.